This is Elliot Haspel. Welcome to another edition of Best Practices Weekly. Today we're going to be talking about teaching poetry, and this is from an older article on The Reading Teacher, where a writing specialist talks about tips and suggestions for teaching poetry to elementary school students. And this is focused on the idea that often teachers are not as confident in how they're teaching poetry because it's slightly more of an obscure topic compared to prose and reading comprehension and those sorts of things. And so often teachers may rely on some pretty straightforward tools like rhyming poems or fill-in-the-blank type of poetry, which is fine in its own right, but doesn't get to the true heart of what poetry is. And so the author comes up with a couple of suggestions for different strategies for teaching poetry, and then a 10-step action plan, which I'm going to go over briefly. And so the two strategies he suggests first is imitate great authors. And what he says here is if you read great poetry with your students, discuss it and then ask students to write poetry in that style, a lot of the writing fundamentals actually come in and come out through the sort of imitation. Second, ask or question the author. Question the poet. What this means is helping students with very targeted, prompted questions think about why did the poet choose to do it this way? Why did this poet write this part of their poem in this particular way? Why did they choose this style? Why did they choose this word? So less about let's understand what the poem means, and more let's try to get into the head of the poet and see what he or she was thinking when she was constructing the poetry. And this takes much more preparatory work on the part of the teacher because as the teacher you have to have already gone through the poem, marked it up, figured out where are the points you're going to stop, what questions are you going to ask to prompt discussions among students, and what are the sorts of follow-up questions you're going to ask to keep pushing them along the way. But putting in that upfront work is really worth it because students can really start to understand how poetry works, not just what it means. And then the author has this action plan for sort of boosting your poetry units and boosting your poetry instruction. And first is read great poetry yourself. And it doesn't matter what you define as great poetry, something that speaks to you, and think about why do I think this is great poetry? What is it about it that elicits a response in me? Second, question the author. Similar to the strategy with the students, think about why is the poet doing this? And try to put yourself in the poet's shoes. And then also, when you're questioning the poet and questioning the author, think about, is this the sort of prompt that would work well with my students? And is this the sort of style that would work well with my students, asking them to imitate it? Third, write a poem yourself. This again puts you in the shoes of a poet. It puts you in the shoes of what the students are going to be doing when you ask them to do it, and therefore you're going to be living those processes. Then read your poem to someone, whether it's a friend or your students, again, getting in that part of the process of hearing it read and of being someone who is conveying information, conveying feeling through a poem. Fifth, borrow a poetry lesson. If you're not feeling so confident, take one from another teacher or from the internet or from any other book, any of those resources, and start off there. Then, sixth, integrate what you know. Teachers are very strong in many different areas, so think about the techniques you use for reading comprehension instruction. How can you adapt those into the poetry lessons? Seventh, create your own poetry lesson. This is what many of us do already, but think about using your own poem as a model. And see, these kind of link up because if you're using your own poem as a model, and if you wrote that poem in the style of the author who you believe to be a great poet, and if you thought about why the poet wrote that way, then it all links up and you're going to be teaching a lesson based off one of your poems that you've written, but ultimately all links back to great poetry. Then, number 8 is share your students' poetry. Make sure there's deliberate space for sharing and celebrating the student work. 9th is share your lesson with other teachers and with other colleagues. And 10th, publish. If this worked really well, consider publishing your lesson and the student results, the student work, in a journal, in a magazine, online, sharing it far and wide. And so the author's conclusion is that all of these are ideas to really get us out of that space as teachers of sort of dreading poetry because it might be something we're not feeling so confident about ourselves, but instead to a place where we can really get students to understand the heart of poetry and really become better poets ourselves, even as we're helping our students become better poets themselves. So thanks for watching and happy teaching.